My name is Vyushkova. I'm an expert in ethnic composition of the Russian side war losses, war casualties of the Ukraine war. So I'm an expert with Batan Indigenous Foundation, and also I'm currently an MPhil student of the social anthropology program at the University of Cambridge. So I'm a PhD chemist by training, and I am actually, my field of research used to be quantum computing, and I used to work in the Silicon Valley at some point. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, like Donatas mentioned, I was a co-founder of Free Buryats Foundation, and my career has totally changed since that time. So I switched to social sciences in order to do research on this topic. And the topic of my talk today is Putin's militant Buryats, or боевые буряты Putin in Russian, Ukraine war, and the connection of the Putin's militant Buryats meme with the Mongol Yoke or Horde legacy, so-called Horde legacy theory in both anti-Kremlin Russian and Ukrainian political thinking and media discourse. So first of all, let's see what is the factual context, because behind any meme, any rumor, any media story, there is some factual background. Yet it might be totally different, right? It might be totally different from what people say about this stuff. And this is what happened in this case. So as you can see, it is true that indigenous Siberian and Arctic indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented among the Russian side casualties of the Ukraine war, and it was discussed in the morning session today. And as you can see, the death toll, the per capita death toll is especially high for Arctic indigenous people, such as Chukchi, Nenets, Koryak, Inuit, Itelmen of Kamchatka. Stefan talked about them this morning. And also the so-called non-small numbered indigenous Siberian nations as Buryats, Tuvans, and Sakha. And precisely because it is more difficult to distinguish Sakha names and from Russian names and Sakha people from other Arctic indigenous people such as Yukagirs, Evenki people, and so on. Because of that, for Sakha, the number of Sakha casualties, we only have an estimation, but we can tell that it is clearly much higher than Russia's average number of casualties per capita. So all this data is based on open source obituaries of soldiers killed in action. The obituaries which were published either on Russian language social networks or in the local media. And at this point, activist groups have gathered a huge data set of more than 130, I believe, thousand names. So there are two very widespread misconceptions about this, which I want to warn you against. First of all, though very significantly overrepresented, Arctic and Siberian indigenous people are still a small minority, both in the Russian army and among the casualties. So that's why Russian politician Vladimir Kara-Murza was very wrong in his speech at the French Senate in April 2025, because in his speech he said that the majority of Russian army are ethnic minorities, which is of course not the case. 80% of Russia's populations are Russians, and the army's ethnic composition cannot be possibly much different from that. And second major misconception is that it is widely believed that those ethnic inequalities may be explained just as a result of economic inequality among the regions, not ethnic inequalities per se. This is not true. But these misconceptions actually stems from misrepresentation of the paper by Alexei Besudnov, where he did analyze ethnic and regional inequalities in Russian military fatalities in Ukraine. But his method was based on a machine learning algorithm, which identified so-called non-Russian or non-Slavic names among the casualty lists. But as we all know, the Arctic indigenous casualties, as well as Sakha and Irkutsk Buryats, cannot possibly be detected with such an algorithm precisely because they have Russian names. And second, Besudnov only considered so-called ethnic republics and did not look into indigenous ethnic minorities who don't have their own ethnic republic or who live outside their ethnic republics, such as Irkutsk and Aga Buryats or Astrakhan Kazakhs, for example. And because of that, he overlooked very important ethnic disproportions, ethnic inequalities, which could not possibly be explained away by inequality among the regions. There is clearly ethnic disproportion within such regions as Astrakhan with Kazakhs, Aga, Buryats in Aga, and Irkutsk Oblast, and also the indigenous peoples of the north of the Arctic. So I just want to warn you against these two popular misconceptions. So ethnic minorities are not a majority in Russian army. And second, ethnic inequalities in the death toll, war death toll, cannot be explained away by economic inequalities among the regions. So while the Buryats singled out and made turned into a generalized enemy or war criminal figure, first of all, it's important to note that actually military units from Buryatia were involved in the Donbas war since 2015 under the guise of Donbas militia, but obviously their Asian appearance blew the cover of the secret presence of the Russian army. So fighting on the Donbas militia side. So in reality, when it was discovered that there are military units from Buryatia, it was not possible to deny anymore that Russian army is participating in Donbas war. And second, when in July 2015, a Russian propaganda video was released by the so-called SET or Network Youth Organization, these young Buryat men and women declared themselves Putin militants Buryats in this video. And this eventually led to the birth of Putin's militant Buryats meme. And as a result, since that time, any Asian-looking Russian soldiers are now routinely labeled as Buryats or Putin's militant Buryats, боевые буряты Putina, by the Ukrainian media. So it doesn't matter which ethnicity this person is. If it is a Russian army soldier and if he looks more or less Asian, he will be most likely labeled as a Buryat. And there are a lot of racialized war crime allegations involving so-called Buryats, but it's not clear in many cases whether or not it was about ethnic Buryats or Asian-looking Russian soldiers in general. And the most prominent cases are, first of all, the Bucha massacre in the city of Bucha, Kyiv region, March 2022. And second is a makeshift concentration camp in Yadin, Chernihiv region, where two soldiers from the Motor Rifle Brigade 55 were accused of holding the civil residents of the village of Yadin in a school basement under horrific, unbearable conditions for 4 weeks, where 10 people died. So there were 368 people and less than 1 square meter per person in the school basement. But later on, the two soldiers were tried and convicted in absentia. Later on, Ukrainian, which is important, Ukrainian side investigative journalists established that it was actually a totally different military unit from Yekaterinburg, absolute majority of ethnic Russians, and some of them even Ukrainians, who actually were responsible for keeping people in that basement. And eventually, Ukrainian authorities had to issue an indictment and actually convict officers from that military unit in absentia as well, after the two ones were accused. However, there were obvious mistakes in the indictment against the two soldiers, because at least 2 of them were killed on March the 14th, and therefore they could not possibly hold anyone hostage until March 28th. And second, one of those 2 soldiers in an official indictment by Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office was accused of what happened 3 days after his death. So there was a war crime against the civilians, which happened on March the 17th, but that guy was killed on March the 14th. So he could not possibly have done that. So the identification of the Asian-looking war crime perpetrators by Ukrainian prosecutor's office is highly problematic, because you can call in question the rest of identifications and indictments after this case. That's pretty obvious. And also with Bucha massacre, actually military units from Buryatia were falsely accused of being responsible for the Bucha massacre, and yet again, Ukrainian investigative journalists such as Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and Suspilne found out that actually it was the Pskov and Rostov division, almost exclusively ethnic Russians again, who were responsible. And unfortunately, the Sunday Times publication misrepresented the evidence as well, because they specified wrong geographic location, which is not Bucha. And in this picture, we can see a war crime survivor, a woman whose son was killed. She describes the perpetrators as 5 Buryats, though they were identified as 5 Pskov paratroopers, and only one of them was an Asian, though he was not a Buryat. Yet she describes them as 5 Buryats. Another important tendency is racialization of occupation of Ukrainian territories, where surprisingly often in Ukrainian media and on social media, occupation of Ukrainian territories is literally described as occupation by Asians or even occupation by Buryats, though there is no like that many Buryats in Russia in order to occupy all those Ukrainian territories. That's very interesting that, first of all, Ukrainians are complaining that Russians are supposedly trying to ethnically replace Ukrainians living in occupied territories with Buryats, which is just statistically impossible. And second, like in this picture, this person who was in occupation, under occupation in Kherson region, he says that there were no pure Russians, so-called pure Russians, чистые русские, among the occupiers. They all were either Dagestani or Chuchmeki. Chuchmeki is a derogatory term referring to Asians. So he literally describes occupation of Kherson region as occupation by Asians, though the data on the Russian side, casualties, the obituaries of soldiers who were killed there at that time do not uphold this at all, because there were a lot of ethnic Russians from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad who died there. So this is obviously not true, but this is how people perceive the occupation as occupation by Asians. So, and again, there are a lot of references to the Mongol Yoke, to the Mongol conquest of Rus in the 13th century. And which is interesting, it happens on both sides, both anti-Kremlin Russians and Ukrainians. And they all describe the Ukraine war as the last battle of the Golden Horde, represented by Putin, with Kievan Rus represented by Ukraine, which is also very interesting. And the Russian propaganda is trying to appropriate, actually, this way of thinking and try to glorify the connection between the Golden Horde and the present-day Russian army. So this is very interesting and even funny if you compare this with the famous poem by Alexander Blok, the Scythians. There is a lot in common there. So, let's turn to the so-called Horde legacy or Ardynskaya наследие theory. So, this theory is extremely popular in the present-day anti-Kremlin Russian political thought. And also in Ukraine. So this theory just explains Russia's present-day authoritarian and imperial tendencies as direct consequences of the Mongol Yoke. So, and this originates from Valeria Novodvorskaya, famous Russian political thinker, who wrote about the so-called Mongol Yoke or Horde legacy in 1999 as a defining event or defining trend in Russia's political history. And also it was upheld by prominent political scientist, Russian prominent political scientist Dmitry Oreshkin in his lecture on Golden Horde's imprint on Russia's political culture, where he identifies Russia's Asian and Muslim ethnic minorities as an embodiment of the Horde imprint, which is perceived very negative, very authoritarian, very archaic, and so on. And Oreshkin implicitly equates East versus West, Asia versus Europe, binary oppositions to the Horde and non-Horde distinction, or basically as bad versus good, right? East is bad and West is good, progressive and so on. So, if we look at the sociology data from Ukraine, we find a very interesting fact. Up until the full-scale invasion, even after the Donbas war, up until the 2022, 76% of Ukrainians expressed positive attitude towards Russians. So, and prominent Ukrainian sociologist Vladimir Paniotny describes this as unrequited love towards Russians. But after the 2022 invasion, several months later, we can see that very few, only 11%, still expressed positive attitude towards Russian. So it was a radical change in public opinion. So up until 2022, the so-called brotherly nations, Russians and Ukrainians as brothers, narrative was very, very strong in Ukrainian public opinion. They were very negative towards Vladimir Putin, but very positive towards Russians themselves. But then, just within several months, there was a radical change from unrequited love towards Russians to construction of enemy other. And this enemy other actually was often constructed in racial terms. Russians are not our brothers. We have never been brothers. Because Russians are not Slavic, they are not white. They are either Mongol or Turkic, and therefore somehow inferior, aggressive, barbaric, and inherently hostile to white European civilized Ukrainians, or another, well, it even comes to very disturbing skull measuring, approaches. But another explanation is based on vulgar interpretation of the actual genetic studies of the Balto-Slavic populations. Russians are actually Uralic or Arctic indigenous, again, not Slavic. And this was best expressed by Alexei Arestovich in May 2022. At the time, he was a very influential person in Ukraine. So, and he described the so-called chthonic cults of death and torture originated in the swamps to the north of Moscow as a genetic trace or the essence, which is constantly intertwined with the idea of Muscovite statehood. And he used this to explain events like Bucha massacre and torture of civilians and so on. It's the northern tribes with their death and torture cults who are responsible, a very racist point of view, obviously, but it was extremely popular at that time in Ukraine. And again, if we juxtapose how the same popular Ukrainian journalist speaks about Buryat soldiers in the Russian army and about Pskov paratroopers, we can discover that a Buryat as a racial other and perceived carrier of the Mongol Yoke legacy is viewed as a generalized enemy or war criminal figure. Because when he talks about Pskov paratroopers, who are the actual perpetrators of Bucha massacre, he describes them as crying kids, cry babies. So someone who is pitiful and not dangerous at all. But when he talks about soldiers of Buryat ethnicity, he used them as a generalized war criminal figure. Imagine occupiers entering your home village. A militant Buryat opens the door of your house, shoots and kills your parents, your classmates, your colleagues. So this is how he imagined a generalized enemy or war criminal figure. And this is very telling. So it is, to a very significant extent, built on the racial basis. So, and to conclude with, I just, first of all, I wanted to repeat that they were very significantly overrepresented. Russian, Siberian, and Arctic indigenous people actually constitute a small minority, both in the Russian army and among the Russian side casualties. However, they, and especially Tuvans and Buryats, are often viewed as generalized enemy war criminal figures. And the Mongol Yoke theory, as well as vulgar interpretations of studies of Balto-Slavic population genetics, is invoked to counteract the brotherly nations narrative and reconstruct Russians as racialized enemy others. And in this context, construction of racialized enemy other by Ukrainians and anti-Kremlin Russians as well invokes both anti-colonial, where Ukraine is resisting Russia's imperial aggression, and at the same time Eurocentric and very racist ideas, which is a very interesting mix. And at the same time, paradoxically, in order to other Russians from themselves and create an enemy of them, Ukrainians appear to use ideas which are clearly borrowed from the Russian political thought. And to end with, I'm grateful to Soma Trust for the support of open source data curation for the Arctic Indigenous War Casualties dataset. Thank you.